Good evening. It is good to see each of you here tonight. I want to thank you for being here, and hope that you have had a good afternoon. We're going to look at two different passages of Scripture tonight, the first of which we'll find in James chapter 4. James chapter 4, verse 13. James chapter 4, beginning in verse number 13. We're going to look at this for just a few moments, and then we're going to look back over in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 7. But first in James chapter 4, beginning in verse number 13. It says, "Go to now, you that say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such a city. Continue there a year, buy and sell, and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. For that you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now you rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil. Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin." Here in these verses, James counsels us against the foolishness of making plans without the consideration for the will of God. All James is saying is that you and I can make any plans that we want to, but God always has the final say in any matter. We can make all the plans we want. We can fill our calendars up and our schedules up, but God is going to have the final say in any matter. And you know, when we learn that His plans for the situation, and we make our plans based on His plans, we find out that, I've never found it to be any other way. I have made plans before for things, and God have other plans. And I try to do my best. I know I don't always do it, but I try to go with God's plan. And in the end, anytime that I've went with His plan, I will tell you that I have never found that He didn't have the better plan all along. And we like to make our plans, and we want things to go the way that we want them to go. But we've got to sit back and remind ourselves that God has the better plan. And just a few examples, from the Word of God. When Peter and the others went all night without catching a fish, Jesus told them to go out into the deep water, and they would catch fish. And Peter's plan was to forget fishing all along. He had fished all night. He was ready to go home. That was his plan. That was what he was going to do, whether he had fish or not. But he obeyed the Lord, and guess what? He found out God had a better plan. The better plan was not just to go home. I mean, he reluctantly, Jesus was not a fisherman by trade. And so Peter was. And, if you've ever been around somebody that is a fisherman, that's what they do, they're going to know how to do it. They're going to give you the best, put you in the best spots and give you the best opportunities to catch fish. And I'm sure Peter knew the best places to go. I'm sure he knew all the tricks of the trade. And so for Jesus, the son of a carpenter, to come along, and he was raised by a carpenter. He was a carpenter by trade, and so for him to come along and offer advice to a fisherman, that's not the best plan. Peter said, "We fished all night. If we were going to catch fish, we'd have caught them already." But Jesus had the best plan. When Jesus told the disciples again that he was going to die, Peter, again, I'm not picking on Peter, but you remember Peter rebuked the Lord. He told the Lord, "No, I'm not going to let that happen. That's not going to happen." And Peter thought that he had a good plan, but when Jesus went to the cross and paid for sins forever, Peter found out that God's plan was the best plan. When Goliath saw David coming to meet him for battle, he had plans for what he was going to do with David. He was going to kill David, and he was going to feed his carcass to the scavengers in the field. But listen, when that stone sank into his forehead out there in the middle of that valley, he fell to the earth, and he found out that God had the better plan. When Israel sent spies into Canaan, when they sent those spies into Canaan and they saw the giants that lived there, they made plans to, listen, they weren't going into Canaan. They weren't going to, if they had to, they'd find them a new leader and go back to Egypt. But understand, over the next 40 years, as they died one by one in the wilderness, they learned that, guess what? God's plan was the better plan. If they'd have just been obedient and went in and followed God's plan, and they would have realized earlier that He had the better plan. And we could go on with example after example from the Word of God, but this truth is fleshed out really well here in James, but we're also going to see it fleshed out really well in the book of Judges whenever we go there. And if you want to go ahead and turn over to the book of Judges in chapter 7 and verse number 1, it's a story that you are, I'm sure, familiar with, and it's the story of Gideon, the account of Gideon and his plan, and we're going to see that God's plan was the best plan, but Gideon had a plan. Gideon was prepared for battle, but understand that God's plan was the best plan, and God's plan had already given them victory before it was ever even fought, and they found out that God's plan would be the best plan. And so I want to look at a few things concerning this thought that God has the best plan. We don't always understand that plan. We may not always be comfortable in that plan. We may not at times even like that plan. But I promise you that if we will just follow God and His plan, the end results are better than anything that we can ever imagine. I want to look first of all here at verses 2 through 7 as we see the realities of God's plan. Verse number 2 of Judges chapter 7, "And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, Mine own hand hath saved me. Now therefore go to, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, Whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people are yet too many. Bring them down unto the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, This shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, This shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. And so he brought down the people unto the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, Every one that lappeth of the water with his tongue, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise every one that boweth down upon his knees to drink. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men. But all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, By the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand, and let all the other people go every man unto his place. And so here we see, Gideon had a plan. Gideon had his army set up, and they were ready to go. And the reality of God's plan is that God's plan is usually a different plan. God's plan is usually a different plan. Gideon planned to march in with 32,000 soldiers. That's a long ways from 300, isn't it? That's a long ways from 300. And so we have to remember that when we make our plans for our lives, guess what? When I make the plans for me, I try to stack things in my favor, right? I want things to be in my favor, and I think that's human nature. However, God will usually have a different plan for your life than you do. God will typically have that different plan. And so, you go back and you look at David. Where was David before his father sent him to check on his brothers? He was a shepherd, tending to his father's sheep. The reality is, do you think that in David's mind that he ever saw him as anything other than a shepherd? Probably not. The youngest son would be overlooked for every other job imaginable. He would get the least amount of inheritance. He would just be, he was just, that's just what he was. And, so David was just a shepherd, but guess what? God had a different plan. God had a different plan. I'm sure even whenever, Samuel came and they were looking through the sons there. Sure, David thought, there ain't even no sense in me going in there. I'm not going to be chosen. But God had a different plan, didn't he? Think about Job. Job was a wealthy man. Job just wanted to worship his God and love his family and enjoy his wealth. But God had a different plan. God had a different plan. Think about Mary and Joseph. Young couple just wanting to get married. They were literally, they were not anybody of any significance. They just wanted to get married and live their lives. And guess what? God had a big, major different plan for them, didn't he? You talk about bringing attention and having all the stuff surrounding them that they did. God had a different plan. Saul of Tarsus, the day that he set out on the road to Damascus, he was just wanting to go to Damascus and persecute Christians. He wanted to punish them because in his mind they were doing wrong. And that's all he wanted to do. He wanted to please the religious leaders and the religious elitists. That's all he wanted to do. But God had a different plan, didn't he? God had a different plan, and God has different plans for us. We don't always, I've shared with you my story, and I know you probably get tired of hearing it, but it's my story. Jerry wanted to be a cop. That's what Jerry wanted to do. But God had a different plan. God, did I ever in my, I've had people ask me, just because my granddaddy's a preacher and, the fact that he was pastoring and was, well known, and we grew up in his church for a while. And, I've always had people ask me, did you ever feel like that you would just follow in his footsteps? I said, absolutely not. Not for 1 minute did I ever think. And I've even said, I look back on it now, even all the times that, I didn't understand as a little boy, I'd go with Granddaddy on hospital visits. I didn't know. It's just, I want to be with my Granddaddy. That's all I cared about. And I look at all that and I think, man, was God doing something there? Probably so. God has different plans than we do. We have to be mindful of that. And the test of a truly consecrated life is we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to submit to God's plan? That's where the difficulty comes in. God has a plan, and it's a different plan than us, and we can acknowledge that, but are we willing to submit to God's plan? And, even when His plan, and especially when His plan contradicts our plan, God has a different plan. God's plan is a declared plan. Look at verse number 9. We're going to read down through verse 14. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, Arise, get thee down unto the host, for I have delivered it into thine hand. But if thou fear to go down, go thou with Phurah thy servant down to the host. And thou shalt hear what they say, and afterward shall thine hands be strengthened to go down unto the host. Then went he down with Phurah his servant unto the outside of the armed men that were in the host. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along the valley like grasshoppers for multitude, and their camels were without number. and as sand by the seaside for multitude. And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow, and said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent, and smote it that it fell, and overturned it, that the tent lay along. And his fellow answered and said, This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. Understand that God's plan is not only a different plan, but it's a declared plan. Here is Gideon. He has seen his 32,000 man army diminished and reduced to just 300. He's getting ready to attack a force that is much larger than his own. And, God's not asking for a leap in the dark here. God's asking for a step in faith. He's not asking for him to step out into the darkness. He's asking him for a clear step of faith. Understand this. God 100% knew Gideon's fears. He knew Gideon's concerns. He knew the worry that Gideon had about this. And, listen, you think about what we see here that Gideon hears from the enemy. He hears about this dream that this man has. And listen, God is letting him know. God is just simply, by that happening, God is reassuring Gideon. That Gideon, I've got this. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to give you the victory. When it comes to you and me, the Lord expects us to walk in obedience to His will. But again, just like He didn't expect Gideon to step out into the dark, He doesn't ask us to step out for a blind leap in the dark. He always asks His children to respond to His plans by them taking a clear step of faith. It's not darkness. It's faith. God uses so many means to speak to His children. He speaks to us through His Word. He speaks to us through His Spirit. He speaks to us through other believers. And He even speaks through the circumstances of our lives. Understand this, that God is always going to communicate and speak very clearly and plainly. He's going to guide and direct your feet plainly. He's not going to leave you in doubt. His plan is a declared plan. We also need to know that for us to know that plan, it takes prayer. It takes patience. It takes living a life that is pleasing and honoring to Him. But be sure in His time He's going to reveal that plan. There were times whenever I felt like that there was something going on. God was calling me to something, didn't have really an understanding or an idea of what it was, and it took time, but God made it very clear and very evident what His plan was. And His plan is the best plan. The surest path to knowing His plan is to practice, I believe, what Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 tells us. Paul said, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, that which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds. Practice that. If we want to know God's plan, we have to practice that. We have to present our bodies. We have to renew our minds to a new way of thinking. And let's look on at as we see God's plan is also a distinct plan in verses 15 through 23. And it was so when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and lamps and within the pitchers. And he said unto them, Look on me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that as I do, so shall you do. When I blow a trumpet, and I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And so Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch, and they had but newly set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers that were in their hands. And the 300 companies, or the 3 companies, blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers, and held the lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And they stood every man in his place round about the camp. And all the hosts ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Bethshittah in Zererath, and to the border of Abel-Meholah. I've tried that one all day, but unto Tabbath. And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, and out of Asher, and out of Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. Gideon's men were to surround the enemy. 300 of them to surround the enemy, and it was 300 against thousands. Thousands. I mean, you see back over in verse 12 and how it describes the numbers of the Midianites. The vast numbers. And so 300 against thousands. They were to sound their trumpets and shout for the battle and break the little clay pitcher containing an oil lamp. And God said that this would give them the victory. And guess what? It did. I don't know about you, but that's not how I would have planned to have attacked the Midianites. In fact, I'm just going to be very honest with you. If I knew that there were thousands upon thousands of men camped out down there, me and my 300, we might would have turned around and said, no, we can't do this. I'd have been like the spies that went into to Canaan. I'd have probably been just like one of those 10 and said, no, we can't do this. But listen, God gave them a plan. He gave them instructions, and they followed those instructions, and they came out victory. He gave them victory, and again, what a distinct plan. What a distinct plan it was. Can I tell you that God has distinct plans for our lives? He has distinct plans for each one of us. And when you look at this, no man would have came up with that plan. No military mind would have came up with that plan. And here's the thing. Don't miss this. Could Gideon and his men have said, no way, we're not doing that? That doesn't even sound right. We're going to go home. Sure, they could have. They absolutely had that right. God was not forcing them. Just like He didn't force the children of Israel to go into Canaan. They went in, they made their own. God gave them instruction. God said, hey, this is my plan for you. You're going to go in. They sent the spies in. The spies came out. They said, no, we can't do that. The people agreed with them, and they didn't. And you know what they did? They missed out on God's blessings. They missed out on being able to see God at work. And you know what? Even more, they missed out on God's best for their lives. I'm going to tell you, when God gives us plans, and it may be a different plan, and He gives us directions, understand that He's going to give us a distinct plan, and we're to follow that plan just as He lays it out. Now, it's not ours to tweak. The minute that you tweak God's plan, it's no longer God's plan. The minute that you change something about it, it's no longer His, it's now yours. And so when it fails, I think a lot of times people get upset and they want to know God's plan's not working. I have followed God. Listen, you better make sure that you haven't changed God's plan somewhere along the way to be what you want to be. Like I said, it doesn't matter. The slightest change, the slightest thing that you do that's not what God distinctively said. If they had went out there and they had said, listen, we're gonna go out, we're gonna spread up 100 here, 100 here, and 100 here. We're going to go out and we're going to blow the trumpets and we're going to shout and we're going to run. And we're going to go after them. Let me tell you, that's not what God said to do. God told them to take those pictures and break them. So the minute they leave one part out, it's no longer God's plan. Do we understand that? We have to make sure that we follow, when God gives a plan, it's a distinct plan. I think sometimes we get upset at God because His plan doesn't work, but it's not His plan that's not working, it's we've changed something. We've tweaked it along the way. We see the realities of God's plan, but what are the requirements? What are the requirements of God's plan? Let me tell you, God's plan requires surrender. It requires us to surrender. Think about this. Again, Gideon was a man with 32,000 followers, but by following God, he saw his army reduced, his rank lowered, his pride crushed. He was reduced from General Gideon to Gideon of the barley cake. Go back and look at verse 13. That's what it was reduced. He went from being considered a great leader of men to being called a dog biscuit. Now, think about that. I mean, Gideon's ego, hey, I've got 32,000. We're ready to go to war. 32,000. We're ready to go. We're ready to fight. We're ready to take this on. And no doubt there were people that were with him out of that 32,000 that were scared, because what happened whenever he gave them the chance to go back home? Quite a few of them left. But Gideon sees that number reduced, and now here he is. And man, his army, this is not what he had envisioned. This is not what he was planning. His goals, his dreams, his will aside, so that he might surrender to the will of God. We have to make sure that we are willing to surrender to His will. It's what the Lord requires of those who are going to walk in His perfect will. Those who see the reality of the fact that God has the best plan are those who turn from their plan to go with God. It requires surrender. Gideon had to surrender. We have to surrender. God's plan requires submission. Listen, they had to submit to that plan. They had to submit themselves to that plan. And, going from 32 to 22, 9,700 men, they turned and went home, and taking weapons and their potential with them, and now Gideon and 300 remained. They had to walk in obedience to God's plan for the battle, or guess what? Not one of them, I believe, would have had a chance to survive. If they had gone against God's will, I don't believe one of them would have survived that. Again, if they'd have changed it, they had to submit to His will. Again, whenever we get to those times that we may not like that the Lord is telling us to do, and we may not understand it, listen, we just got to do it anyway. We just got to do it anyway. It requires steadfastness. They would have to humble themselves under God's hand, surrender to His plan, obey His will, and proceed in faith. God's going to ask us at times to take steps in our lives that, hey, they're difficult, and you may be unsure of them. But that's where you got to have faith. That's where you got to trust Him. You got to stay steadfast. And the Word of God tells us that we're to have our faith without wavering. You got to keep that faith and have that faith without wavering. However, to me, the best part of all of this is whenever we're willing to do those things are the results that go along with it. The results, whenever we can surrender and we can submit and we can be steadfast in God's plan for our lives, the results make it all worth it. Here, again, we see the enemies are vanquished. The enemy's vanquished. Look at verse 21 again. And they stood every man in his place round about the camp. And all the host ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled into the border. They left. They fled. Got out of there. The enemy was vanquished, weren't they? They were gone. Listen, the Midianites and the Amalekites, listen, they turned to one another and they hightailed it out of there. It was like somebody that had seen a ghost. They left. They were defeated. Was it because Gideon's army was so massive and just so well prepared? No. They may have been prepared. They were victorious because they followed God's plan. I don't know about you, but I like victory. Amen. I don't like to lose. I like victory. It's no matter what it is. Doesn't matter. If it's playing phase 10 against Heidi, I love it. She does not feel the same way, though. I promise you. She likes victory, too. If it's playing tic-tac-toe, don't think my daughter does not like victory over her daddy. She gets me every now and then. She got to earn it, but she gets it. But we like victory. Listen, if we want victory in life, we've got to submit to God's plan, surrender to God's plan, and be steadfast. We got to keep faith. We got to trust Him and know that, hey, I don't understand this. It doesn't make sense to me. I can't wrap my mind around why God would want me to do it this way. It's not how I would have done it. But I'm going to remain faithful to Him. That's when we see victory. That's why Gideon and his men, the 300, they were able to see the victory. They were able to see the enemy vanquished and removed. But I'm going to tell you, the greatest thing about all of it is the fact that because of this victory, God was glorified. God was glorified. Because listen, how else could they explain it? How were they able to? Can you imagine that 300? You got to know that the ones that were sent home and the ones that turned around and went back home thought, we'll never see those 300 again. We won't see them. There's no way. They're just walking into a death trap. They might as well just went ahead and committed suicide. Going that way, doing that. Didn't make sense. What kind of glory do you think God was able to get whenever that 300 was able to go back home victorious and say, hey, God gave us the victory. God was glorified. I'm going to tell you, there's naysayers in everything that we do. And people may, when you're following God's plan, people may look and say, I don't think that's going to work. But if you just follow God's plan and stick with it and trust Him and surrender to Him, it's going to work and He's going to be glorified. I'm telling you, and this has nothing to do with me, but I think I've shared this with y'all. I'm pretty sure I have. Still don't understand it, don't know where it came from, don't know why, it doesn't really matter. When I came here, people, I don't know if there was a betting line as to how long I was going to last. I don't know. But I've heard, people say, hey, there's a lot of people that didn't think you'd make it. I don't know why. Maybe they saw something I didn't see. However, when I came here, it wasn't about me. It wasn't my plan. Didn't know anything about Tifton, Georgia. I just knew it was God's plan. And I needed to surrender to it, and I needed to follow it and stick with it. And He gets the glory for it. Because I believe we've seen victories. I believe we've seen good things, and I believe God's still doing good things. We just got to stick with His plan. We don't have to understand it. We may be uncomfortable with it, but just trust Him. I promise you, Gideon was not comfortable taking 300 men to battle, but he trusted God. I promise you, some of the changes that we looked at early on in our text, or in this message, with David and with Peter and with, all these, I'm sure their plan was not what God's plan was. And that's okay. But we got to remember that God's plan is best plan. We got to make sure that when we make plans, that we make plans contingent based on, hey, if it's God's will. If it's His will, that's what James said. Don't make plans and just assume everything's going to go how you want it to go, and that you're going to do it. Some folks make plans, and the saying about come heck or high water. They're going to make their plans, and they're going to follow through with it. I promise you, if God's plan is different than that, you better follow through with God's plan. You better leave your plan. Amen. Anybody have any thoughts, comments, or questions tonight?